I now give the floor to my Thai colleague, Professor Pombejra, who will tell us about Ayutthaya.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Well, thank you again to the organizers for inviting me here. It's a great honor to be here. My talk is neither going to be about complexity nor heritage as such, but be a kind of bird's eye view of Ayutthaya, which is considered one of the hubs on the Maritime Silk Road. This is a picture of, you can see that it's an island, surrounded by rivers, and that's one of the reasons why it prospered. It's one of the greatest of the monastery ruins dating from the 17th century, which, as I argue in my talk, was the golden age of its trade. So this is not always the way that people have seen Ayutthaya. As a child, I remember being taught that Ayutthaya is seen as a classical age in Thai history and that it rose to prominence in Southeast Asia thanks to its kings being great warriors, conquering Sukhothai in the north, conquering Angkor eventually in the east. And it's only in the past 30 or 40 years that there's been, I suppose, a turn in the interpretation of Ayutthaya to now Chris Baker is saying that Ayutthaya has risen from the sea rather than from the land and the heroism of its kings. Okay? And just to prove that historical periodization is hell, this huge Buddha image in Ayutthaya predates the so-called founding of Ayutthaya by over 20 years. And this is in Wat Phanan Cheng, which is now associated with Sampokong, with Zheng He, although it's most likely that he never made it to Ayutthaya himself. Okay, so it's undeniable, however, that Ayutthaya's situation is in the middle of a very fertile river basin, the Chao Phraya River Basin, and therefore it could sustain quite a big population, relatively big population. I'm always asked by my students, how much was the population? And I have no real answer to that. I think Anthony Reid speculates, but based on a few Western sources. But when I say probably only about 100,000 or 200,000 in the city, and then I look at another source and says 30,000 monks in Ayutthaya. Oh, you can't have 100,000 population if there are 30,000 monks. But anyway, that's a problem for the future. So this state grew as a kind of agrarian state, and it remained in an agrarian state all through its history. And that's a point that I think we should bear in mind, even when talking about Ayutthaya as a maritime hub. I mean, it was a kind of hybrid polity, I suppose. It was both a rice-growing hinterland state and also a city with very good access to the sea and whose rulers were very keen to milk the most from this proximity to the sea. Smaller junks and smaller Western-style sailing vessels could sail right up from the mouth of the Chao Phraya River to this place. My surname, comes from this place. Pompet. It's spelled Pombejra, but it's pronounced Pompet. It means diamond fortress. But unfortunately, we have neither diamonds nor control of the fort. It's just a locality in Ayutthaya where a lot of Chinese lived. So my ancestors were Chinese who married Mon, and that's a real maritime heritage. But anyway, this is just to prove that the river was very navigable. And the Gulf of Siam, and you can see the river going up from Bangkok area up to Ayutthaya in the upper part of the picture. The Thai kings realized that there could be great benefits from improving the waterways linking Ayutthaya with the sea. So in the 15th, 16th centuries, they ordered the digging of canals, which cut through meanders in the river, which shortened the distances considerably. And it took about 2 full days from the river mouth to Ayutthaya, which is not bad compared with mouth of the Irrawaddy to Ava, which took a few months. Yeah. So again, I'd like to emphasize that the port of Ayutthaya depended on the hinterland for supplies of both forest produce and sometimes from live animals as well, which formed the bulk of its exports. And then from the soil, of course, you had and the rivers, you had the minerals. Almost none of its local export goods were manufactured. Anything that was highly manufactured, such as Chinese silks or Indian textiles, came from elsewhere, and were re-exported. Much of the stuff here was really from the hills and the forests. A notable exception was pottery. And then I don't know about this Ming gap theory and all that, but shards of glazed and unglazed Thai ware, central Thai ware, have been found all around Southeast Asia, including the Philippines, Indonesia. So what were these hinterland products? Well, we Thais like to call them or categorize them as khong pa, or forest produce. It includes aromatic wood, such as eaglewood, and then the dye wood like sappan, and then includes deerskins. In a certain year in the 17th century, the Dutch East India Company exported 500,000 pieces of deerskin in just one season. So maybe they were all hunted out by the end of the 17th century. No, that is not serious. Okay, but there were also live elephants, and there was ivory. And of course, maybe even more important in terms of value, the gold and the benzoin were not found in the territory of Ayutthaya, but they made their way down to Ayutthaya regularly through land caravans. So when you look at Ayutthaya, you must not be seduced by the sea, and you should always have a look behind your back at all the inland waterways and caravan tracks which led down to Ayutthaya. And so some of the stuff which could be re-exported to other parts of the world came through this land route. Now, the Gulf of Siam and its estuaries supplied rayskins, and as proof of the living heritage of Ayutthaya, you can find and buy this rayskin wallet in Chatuchak market in Bangkok every weekend. It's about they've come back to producing rayskin products, but in the past it was used mainly to cover the hilt of Japanese swords. Tin was also the most important of the minerals, although there was also lead. This is a charming engraving from Francois Valentine of Siamese rayskins. Now, I still don't know whether they're stingrays or manta rays or estuarine or sea rays. This is from the 18th century. Now, the political, commercial, and cultural life in Ayutthaya was dominated by the court. As in many countries, the trade of kings was traditionally seen as war and politics and merit-making and the acquisition of white elephants, etc., rather than the conduct of commerce. In fact, a French missionary from the 17th century summarized that to engage in commerce was beneath a nobleman's dignity in Siam, and that you shouldn't be dirtying your hands with commerce. But of course, everybody who came into Siam, whether 16th, 17th, or 18th century, one of the first things they remarked upon was that the king was a primary trader in this kingdom. So he certainly knew how to use certain, apparatus and certain expertise in getting profit from maritime commerce. And he certainly sold goods, both to foreign traders and to his own subjects from the stuff that he accumulated in his warehouses. Because the king monopolized part of the trade. But the royal monopoly system in Siam was not a static one and not an absolute one. Not every commodity was monopolized, and whatever was monopolized was not monopolized in perpetuity, not forever. It changed according to the suitability. Now, the king also had shipping of his own, especially from the 1620s onwards. Okay, and crown ships reached ports as far west as in Arabia and as far east as in Japan. So everything seemed to be dominated by the court. Whenever a foreign trader wished to buy certain goods, which were monopoly goods, he had to contact the king's factors. When he wanted to leave the country, he had to ask for a passport with the royal seal on it. And this could be a very suspenseful procedure, because if you missed the monsoon wind, then you really had it. You stay for another year, and that's ruinous. And of course, the main reason why the king traded was because, according to the Western documents from the 17th century, more than half of his annual revenue came from foreign trade, both through duties which were collected on trade done by foreigners, and through the sale of goods on his own behalf, both at home and abroad. Silver was brought in because it's needed for currency, and so this was one of the big exchanges. Silver and copper, these were the precious metal which Siam needed, not just to mint currency, but this is a society which is, I don't like early modern. This is pre-modern. What do the kings spend all these riches on? They made merit, huge Buddha images like the one that I showed you in the second, third slide. I mean, this took a lot of metal, okay? And also another was to increase the magnificence of his own court, to increase the luxury. When we're talking about the court elite, this court elite also took part in the trade, such as the phrakhlang minister, who was in charge of foreign affairs and the royal treasury, and other senior ministers, because they didn't have salaries. Okay, and this print from Lalubert, French diplomat who came in the late 17th century, and this is a depiction of the Siamese mandarin, a Siamese nobleman or high official, and a woman, and Siamese house, all that. Now, as I said before, one of the factors that affected the success or otherwise of royal trade was in the control of monopolies. Even in the European sources, you get an idea that there were many leaks, that if you cannot buy if you cannot buy ivory in Ayutthaya, then go to another river estuary and you'll find Chinese who can sell you some ivory there. And so there's this kind of leakage and smuggling. But I think that the court controlled much of it. Okay, and then the second factor, I think, is also very, very important, or even more important, is the use of personnel. Foreign traders, nakhodas, navigators, and even seamen, these people knew their stuff, and is one of the truisms or platitudes that were bandied around by Western visitors to Siam, to Ayutthaya, that the Thais were lousy sailors, that they can only get on their boats and do some coastal trading, and that they cannot go across to Japan or even to China, and certainly not to India. And so the kings used foreigners to help him. Now, about the goods monopolized, I don't have the time to go into detail, but the example I've brought up is the textile for elephants trade, which went on all through the 17th century and also a little bit into the 18th century. Indian textiles like these, many of them made from patterns which were sent by the Siamese court. So these details, the designs were very, very Thai, but they were all woven and printed and painted in India. These are from the Coromandel. This is from John Guy's book on the export textiles of India. And they were sold consistently, regularly in Ayutthaya. And in the 17th century, they were sold in exchange for elephants, mostly. Elephants were, as Professor de Romanis, one of his slides says, that all the Indian courts, especially the southern Indian courts, okay? I think maybe you divide them into horse cultures and elephant cultures, but the ones with elephant cultures had hundreds and hundreds of elephants. I think in a book by Jos Romans, it says on Mughal warfare, he says that it was difficult for a ruler in the Deccan or even the Mughal, the great Mughal himself, to go into Bengali or Assamese forests. You know, it would take a huge effort. So it's easier and more convenient to buy them from Southeast Asia. So elephants were not only from Siam, also from Myanmar, also from Sumatra, also from Kedah. All these places exported elephants to India. Okay, they went there tame already and of high quality. This is a French missionary drawing, painting of an elephant hunt. Okay, the phrakhlang was in charge of this, but what is more important is that the phrakhlang controlled the port department, and the port department divided into the port department of the left and port department of the right, and this began probably around the 16th century and carried on right to the end of the Ayutthaya period. The port department of the left, which means if you go out of Bangkok, you turn left, you see, which is going east, was controlled by the Chinese, by the Chodik Rajasethi, while the port department of the right was headed by the Muslims, called in European sources Moors. And this is Jula Rajamontri. Jula Rajamontri, the titular head of this department, it's still the title for the leader of the Muslim community in Thailand. So about trade that Ayutthaya did with other places, we know about tribute missions to China, and then you have the triangular relationship in the early period between the Ryukyu kingdom based in Naha, China and Siam, whereby Chinese and Japanese goods reached Siam, and forest produce from Southeast Asia, not just Siam, could be transported to East Asia. And then, of course, relationships with neighbors. And I think always that it's not really about the glory of the kings, but about commercial rivalry that made Ayutthaya want to dominate Malacca. But, of course, they failed to do so. But mentioning Malacca takes us to the point that when the Portuguese conquered Malacca, they were under the idea that Malacca was a vassal of Siam, of Ayutthaya. And Ayutthaya certainly wanted to make everybody believe that. And in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, many of the Malay sultans in the Malay Peninsula sent bunga emas, or the golden flowers of tribute, as tribute to the court of Ayutthaya in return, well, in expectation of trade and provisions in return, and also maybe political support. The rice that was grown in central Siam was in demand almost every year in the Malay sultanates, while Ayutthaya, of course, welcomed the tributes of pepper, which came from Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula. I don't have time to talk about Java or horses, but this will be another lecture. But just to chart the history of Ayutthaya as a maritime hub, it reached its peak in the 17th century during this age of commerce that we've been talking about since the morning, when Southeast Asian products such as spices and pepper were much in demand worldwide. The early 16th century was already one of prosperity, if you believe the Portuguese apothecary Tome Pires, but there was a big gap in the 16th century in Ayutthaya's evolution because of the long series of wars against the Burmese, which ended in defeat for the Thais, and that put a stop to trade for a while. And then it revived again in the 17th century, and that's why it prospered most in the 17th century. And then apart from the Portuguese, now there were more Europeans coming onto the scene, and also the Indians. And the Japanese came directly on their vermilion seal ships, Goshuinjo. It's a picture, a Thai version of the Dutch. This is from the door of Wat Pachetupon, and that's the French ambassador presenting Louis XIV's letter to King Narai in the 17th century. Now, my own research really likes to focus on the cosmopolitan nature or multi-ethnic, multicultural nature of Ayutthaya. And this is shown not just in the urban fabric, the physical fabric with Chinese temples and mosques and churches and all that, but also in the flows of goods and people and cultural ideas that influenced Ayutthaya as a city and as a maritime hub. You see all the divisions of the foreigners. They would be put in separate communities outside the wall of the city. The city is that island part. And we have Chinese in the south, Cochin Chinese, Vietnamese, Malays, Japanese, Portuguese opposite the Japanese. And these foreign communities played a very vital part in the activities of the port in making sure that Ayutthaya prospered as a maritime hub. I've already mentioned the Chinese, I've already mentioned the Muslims, the Moors, but even Europeans played a part, and that's the Greek Constantine Phaulkon, or it should be Hierakis or something, not Phaulkon. He rose to be King Narai's favorite in the 17th century and a minister. And part of the reason why the kings of Ayutthaya liked to employ foreigners was because they were politically relatively tame. They had no power base among the people in Siam. They had no folk back in the provinces or anything like that. And they had a certain particular expertise. In Phaulkon's case, linguistic expertise and also trading expertise. He used to be an employee of the English East India Company. So Phaulkon rose to be kind of indispensable foreign policy man, a foreign trade man. But of course, having no power base, he fell in 1688 as an anti-French, anti-Catholic faction at the court staged a palace revolution, held the king a virtual prisoner in his palace in Lopburi, and had Phaulkon executed. This is Phaulkon, probably fanciful. He came from Kefalonia. Okay, so here he's called Veneziano because Kefalonia was under Venice at that time. Yeah, no. This is the place where he was executed, Luvo, Lopburi. But in order not to make this talk too Eurocentric, Phaulkon's case was not actually all that exceptional, because in the history of Ayutthaya, you also had a Persian phase around 1660s, 1670s, and this Persian phase extended to Mughal and Turks as well. There was a Turk who was governor of Bangkok in 1685, and there was a Mughal cavalry guarding the king. Okay, and there was also a Chinese period later. Okay, after the revocation of the maritime ban by the Qing, there was a Chinese period here because the Thai court also knew how to siphon off profits and benefits from the revival of Chinese private trade with Southeast Asia. You know, the so-called Amoy network, which Professor Untitled has written a wonderful book about. So the fall of Ayutthaya as a maritime hub has been traced to the end of Tony Reid's Age of Commerce around the 1680s. It was supposed to have declined as Dutch maritime power increased, still further in Southeast Asia, affecting or even ending the roles of some Southeast Asian port polities. And the kings of post-1688 Ayutthaya have been characterized as maybe even xenophobic and anti-foreign trade. But I don't really agree with that. There may have been a temporary falling off because of histoire événementielle. Aurangzeb comes and conquers Bijapur and Golconda. So the Masali, Patnam, and all those Coromandel ports were affected. And then you have the problem with the Europeans. So only the Dutch were left trading as a company in Siam. But the Chinese element then comes into its own. And this increased trade leads to an era that I have been describing in court politics, when even the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade was a Chinese. Okay. And I think that the continued role of Ayutthaya on this maritime Silk Road or Silk Route was based on a structural factor. It didn't depend on the prejudices or whims of a certain king who was conservative or not conservative, but the trading apparatus that the state of Ayutthaya had built up from the 14th century onwards was something that was very difficult to discard because it brought in all the revenue. And the kings were surely not stupid enough to throw away all that. Okay. And then one of the last points now, I promise, because I don't want to be taking your time. To many historians of Thailand, they say that what is all this emphasis on Ayutthaya as a maritime hub? It's such nonsense because we're an agricultural state. We're a kingdom where the king was the avatar of Vishnu and the avatar of Indra, the king of heaven. And the Siamese elite continued to see the universe as a Hindu-Buddhist cosmos. Like the second slide I showed you of this beautiful monastery, that's also it's a replication of the Hindu-Buddhist cosmos, with the main stupa being the representation of Mount Meru and all that. And the greatest spiritual good to be gained for the Thai people was, of course, nirvana. And that basically put that the worldview of the Thais didn't change from all these centuries of foreign trade and of Ayutthaya being a maritime hub. It's difficult to argue about the worldview because if you look at even early Bangkok period, early 19th century, late 18th century Thai maps or Thai maps of the cosmos, they don't really reveal any influence from Mercator or Johann Blau or anything like that. But they were very, still full of dragons and Mount Merus and things, but very accurate on the coasts. So the legacy of all these outside foreign elements, I think, should not be underestimated. Western weaponry, military techniques, fortifications, material life change in terms of usage of Indian textiles, cotton textiles as everyday wear in the court, use of Persian-style pointed hats for the mandarins, for the nobility, even cuisine, Portuguese egg-based desserts, foreign words enter the Thai language, like the southern wind in Thai is Lom Salatan. Of course, you know what salatan is, yes? and then the word for bread is pang, nom pang, which is probably from Portuguese rather than French. So the people of Ayutthaya knew of many more nations and cultures and languages in 1767 than they'd been familiar with in 1351. And then you have a look here. This is called Konda Fort. You see the arch structures there. It's replicated in Lopburi Palace in Thailand in Ayutthaya period. Okay, now my last point will be about maritime heritage. Since 1991, Ayutthaya and its ancient city have been inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the Cultural World Heritage Site. This, of course, gave a big fillip to tourism in Thailand and also increased budget or this and that. But it's because Ayutthaya is a city, although it fell to the Burmese in 1767, it was never totally abandoned. So it remains a provincial capital, an agricultural or agribusiness center, and so it's been very difficult for the Fine Arts Department to look after all these ruins properly, and the use of space in this historical park has been criticized very, very violently from many quarters, and there are always threats that UNESCO will revoke this status. But anyway, what about the maritime aspect? Maritime aspect, Ayutthaya's status as a port became the more focus of academic research from the late 80s onwards. Because at that time, and I think it's not coincidental, there was increased Japanese investment in central Thailand, increased industrializations, and Thailand's aspirations to become the next economic tiger in Asia led to this emphasis on studying how we used to be a globalized hub and all that. And the Japanese funded a rather grand Ayutthaya Historical Studies Center in the early 1990s. And two of its rooms are concerned with Ayutthaya's status as a port and Ayutthaya's relations with foreign countries, usually commercial. And then the maritime heritage of Ayutthaya may also be seen in sites such as the Japanese settlement, the Dutch Information Center at Van Hollanda, or the excavated ruins of the Portuguese church. And then I end with pictures of our rather Disneyland maritime heritage. This is Van Hollanda Information Center, built near the site of the Dutch settlement. And this is the Portuguese church in the top. The French church, this is a reconstruction. It's a Victorian building. There used to be one in the 17th century. And then the Japanese settlement. Okay, I'm sorry to have overrun the time, but thank you for your attention.